Tanya. And thank you, everyone, for being here today and attending this lovely conference. Who's having a good time so far? So, well, should you multi-cloud? This is an expression that is very common on my face because every day I think about questions like, should I have that third cup of coffee or not? Or should you multi-cloud? So show of hands, who's already on the yes side of this fence? How about the no side? How about the maybe it depends? Well, for those of you that are on the maybe it depends, we happen to be of like minds. And while it would be nice to stop at it depends, part of my job here today is to give you a framework so that you can ultimately make a recommendation that's well-reasoned about should you multi-cloud. But first, we have to figure out what does multi-cloud actually mean. Definitions are everything, and there's a lot of different variations when people talk about multi-cloud. I'm giving you some words here today for common vocabulary. So number one, if you use both the data center and a public cloud provider, that's what I would call hybrid cloud. Then there's hybrid multi-cloud, which is private cloud versus data centers and public cloud. Then there's multi-cloud or polycloud, which is some combination of public clouds. The difference being multi-cloud in this context means using infrastructure as a service, whereas polycloud means perhaps using platform as a service or software as a service. And speaking of software as a service, that's the fourth variant, where it's public cloud for some things, but a whole lot of third-party software as a service providers for other things. In this talk, I'll predominantly talk about option 2, hybrid multi-cloud, and option 3, multi-cloud or polycloud. So to figure out what multi-cloud looks like for you, the first part of the framework that I offer you is P is for purpose. You have to know your why before you can know your what or your how. And that why has to be based on business. So as much as I love cloud, and I think cloud is cool, and we should just all use cloud every day and all of them, that's really not the point. The point is, what is your business need, and what is their main drivers? For example, are they just looking to extend capacity? Or maybe they're really risk averse, and they want to make sure that your applications survive a failure, even if it's a whole cloud service provider failure. Or maybe it's the risk of vendor lock-in. For legal or regulatory reasons, you have to be able to be nimble when moving to different cloud providers. Whatever the case may be, it's really important to first identify your key business objectives and the key business drivers, and also prioritize them, because it's also common that business wants all of these wonderful things. And so to solve the right problem for multi-cloud, you have to figure out that why. And here's some examples of what you might end up with based on that why. So for example, if you first wanted to extend capacity but keep a private cloud presence, you might end up with the top left, private plus public for capacity extensions. If you wanted to prioritize business continuity, maybe you're predominantly in one public cloud, but you back up your data and are able to restore it in a second public cloud. Maybe you have an acquisition strategy. Your company's growing based on buying other companies. In that case, you might end up with multi-cloud with isolated applications. Or maybe you end up integrating everything, and you end up with multi-cloud where applications span multiple cloud providers. There's no right or wrong answer here, other than the fact that you really need to align to your business drivers. So once you have your business drivers and objectives, you can move on to the next part of the framework, which is L for landing zone architecture. Now, a landing zone architecture is what defines the environment that allows your applications to build and deploy. It also includes all of your standard core capabilities like network and IAM, DNS, et cetera, all the things that should just work so that application teams can build and deploy to your cloud. Now, landing zone architecture is guided by architecture principles, just like any great architecture decision. These 4 are the most common principles that you'll want to think about upfront to answer the question of should you multi-cloud. First one is cloud native or agnostic. That makes a big difference in terms of what types of technology are you going to use. The next one is consistency versus optimization. What that means is, are you going to consistently have the same solutions across all the clouds? Or are you going to locally optimize within that cloud provider for the specific problem at hand? Then self-manage versus manage. this is in the context, again, of these core capabilities around network, DNS, IAM, security scanning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to self-manage these capabilities? Are you going to use the managed version? Are you going to use third parties? This is a principle that's really important to nail down up front because you'll keep coming back to it in all the decisions you'll make for landing zone architecture. And last but not least, affinity versus span. So if you're into reliability, you already know about the concept of a fault domain. And going with that concept, there's this idea that if you isolate workloads within a cloud, that becomes your failure boundary. If you, on the other hand, span across them, well, then that becomes your failure boundary. And so it's just worth thinking about, are you going to adhere to an affinity principle or not? And as an example of how business drivers influence these principles, if I go back to the business driver of business continuity, then one important decision might be what kind of compute technology am I going to use as part of my cloud strategy? Well, if business continuity is the high priority, then I'm probably going to lean more towards cloud solutions that are portable and cloud agnostic versus those that are sticky or cloud native. So in this simple spectrum of compute options, virtual machine, container, and function, you can see that with the principle of cloud native versus agnostic, if I'm leaning towards cloud agnostic, then I'm probably going to start recommending a container-based strategy over a function-based or VM-based strategy. Similarly, if I'm looking for consistency across multiple clouds versus optimizing in place, I see that containers take the lead here again. And so this is just an example to illustrate you have to define your principles based on your business drivers to end up with the right solutions for your multi-cloud strategy. So now we have our why, which is the business drivers and objectives. We have our what, which is the landing zone architecture principles and ultimately the design of your landing zone. Next up is actually the how. And so, as with anything, automation is the key, and that's A for automation. So in order to execute your landing zone architecture, we have to think about your automation strategy. And I say the words automation strategy very deliberately because automation strategy is not just one tool or one solution. And sometimes I enter conversations where I hear things like, yeah, we have an automation strategy because we use this solution. Well, that's great, but that's not actually your strategy. So the key thing with multi-cloud is more cloud means more complexity. You have more to secure, more to protect, more to, well, everything, more to manage, more flavors of cost levers to understand, more network to cover. So let's say you use the 10/8 space. Well, that is actually a finite IP block. How are you going to cover multiple networks? There's more to monitor and maintain, whether you're talking from an operational sense or from a security sense. And I talked about fault domains already, but there's even more to consider in terms of a resiliency strategy and your stability strategy. And so all of that is, frankly, complicated enough in just one cloud. You throw a multi-cloud on top, and you have to start thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to do all those things across multiple clouds, and potentially across a diverse set of solutions to give you those capabilities. And so my recommendation here is your automation strategy should heavily intertwine with your DevOps strategy. Spoiler alert, I love DevOps, so I do talk about it a lot. But it's really important here, too, that when we think about the landing zone and building that through automation, you're also thinking about ultimately how is the landing zone going to be used by all the applications that are going to build and deploy to that particular cloud or clouds. And so if you can define an automation strategy that leverages DevOps so that both your cloud infrastructure and your application workloads have security baked in, have cost optimization baked in, have network governance baked in, you'll find that your multi-cloud complexity can get mitigated somewhat. I'm not going to say it's solved. It's never fully solved, but it can actually be mitigated. So we now know our why, which is our purpose. What was the business trying to do in the first place for multi-cloud? We have our what, our architecture of our landing zone. And now we have an automation strategy to figure out how to automate and execute the landing zone architecture, as well as all those capabilities that are necessary for applications to use the cloud. All right, show of hands. Who thinks the next letter is N? Well, I am a very playful person, so I do like to make jokes that maybe only I find funny, but it's actually C. So C is for continuous monitoring and measurement, because while we've defined our why, our what, and how, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've actually defined our strategy effectively yet. And so I'm a big fan of making sure that we're keeping ourselves honest and truing back to, are we actually effectively deploying a good strategy? And so to do that, we need to think about continuous monitoring and measurement. We need to think about what are the feedback loops that we're going to put into our process and our tools to make sure that, should you multi-cloud, that we answered it, quote unquote, right. And so on the operational side, there's usually considerations like, how is it performing? What's the cost? Are we actually optimizing cost? Are we saving money? On the security side, it's, well, how are we doing with threats? Are we actually having preventive controls and detective controls to mitigate the risk of threats? Are we protecting our data? How are we governing all of these different environments where it can be quite complex at scale when you're across multiple clouds? So as an example, when we think about those principles from Landing Zone and those business drivers, the example that I mentioned was business continuity and perhaps going with a less cloud-native approach than otherwise. Well, when it comes to cost, it's interesting to think about then the total cost of ownership. So if you're going to have to maintain a consistent solution across multiple clouds, typically that means that you're not going to be able to reap the benefit of some of those very specific cloud-native technologies. And the trade-off that you meet is consistency so that you can be portable from one cloud to another. But now, typically that means you're introducing a third-party product or maybe another abstraction layer, and somebody in your company has to maintain that. So from a total cost of ownership perspective, was that in fact the right call? Is there efficiencies to be gained? I don't know. But what I do know is if you can define metrics around total cost of ownership, if you can define thresholds around your cost optimization, those are things that you can monitor over time to give yourself a feedback loop on whether or not that was the right call, or maybe you need to reevaluate that decision. So we've got PLAC. Well, I'm guessing you know the last letter already based on what English word this will end up being. It's E for empower. And so Tanya mentioned in my introduction that I really value creative freedom, which is very true, and I really value empowering people to make good decisions. And so when it comes to should you multi-cloud, we also have to consider that we need to empower the people, both the people that are going to use multiple clouds, or maybe one cloud at a time, and the wonderful people that actually operate the cloud and the core capabilities for the application teams to be successful. And I can't reiterate this point enough, is that it's not just about the technology, it's not just about the business drivers, it's about empowering the people to be able to use the technology effectively to be able to achieve those business outcomes. And the first bubble here is change management, because just like anything else, going to multi-cloud means changing. Maybe you have to change how you do business. Maybe you have to change your entire resiliency strategy because now you're talking about resilience over a different fault domain. Maybe you're changing what kind of patterns you typically use for your applications. Whatever the case may be, part of should you multi-cloud's answer is, what is my change management strategy? How am I communicating this change? How am I getting buy-in? And buy-in at every level, from the top to the bottom, because using one cloud, again, that's already a challenge. Using multiple clouds, a whole other challenge. And one thing that I would recommend avoiding is just migrating from one cloud to another, to another, to another, because that kind of loses the point of the business driver of being able to deliver value for the business. Another important piece of empowerment is training. So we need to upskill talent. Now, does everyone need to know every cloud all at the same level? Maybe, but probably not. Does your operators need to understand how to operate all the clouds? Maybe. It again goes back to your business drivers and your principles of exactly how you're using multi-cloud. Regardless of your exact implementation, though, training is really important to make sure you're upskilling talent to be successful. And that brings me to shared responsibility, and I put the word alignment in here. And that goes back to the concept of buy-in. So shared responsibility, a lot of you may already be familiar with that term. In a cloud context, typically it's talking about the cloud provider is managing some things, you as a cloud user are managing other things. In this context, though, of multi-cloud, it takes on a new meaning around who is operating what. Like literally, who is operating what? Like, is someone operating DNS for Amazon? Is that different than DNS for Google? Whatever the answers may be, you have to define that as part of your answer of should you multi-cloud. Is if you do multi-cloud, and depending on what your multi-cloud is, who is doing what to operate multi-cloud? Who is doing what to be able to use multi-cloud? And are there variations depending on which cloud you're actually in? And there probably are variations because, to be frank, it's quite difficult to achieve parity across multiple environments, at least all at the same time. So day one, you might have variances in how you're operating the different cloud environments. You might have variances in how you're using the different cloud variances. And so if you can make that clear and get alignment with shared responsibility, and then highlight that in your training and have training be foremost in change management, then I think you're on a good path to be successful with your multi-cloud strategy. So to summarize then, P is for purpose, know your why. What was your business trying to do with multi-cloud in the first place? And oh, by the way, they might change their minds over time. So you'll want to refresh the strategy too. Next is L for landing zone architecture, principles, and design. So those principles are heavily influenced by the business drivers that you defined. And the design of your landing zone then very much determines what your final multi-cloud looks like. Is it a multi-cloud based on infrastructure as a service? Is it a polycloud that also incorporates platform as a service? Is it a cloud exit-based multi-cloud where you operate primarily in one cloud and then use the second cloud just for data? Well, whatever the case may be, as long as it's aligned to your business drivers and objectives, you're on a good path. Then, to achieve your landing zone and to make sure you actually get those business outcomes, you need your automation strategy. You need to know how are you going to automate all the capabilities of your landing zone across all of the different cloud providers, whether that's private or public or some combination thereof. And then we have, of course, C, not N, continuous monitoring and measurement. What are the metrics that you're going to define that tells you whether or not your multi-cloud answer was correct? Or another way to think about it is just as business needs change and technologies change, it's helpful to be able to reevaluate the answer to your question. Maybe you started out from a cloud exit position, but then maybe through some innovation from your teams, you and the business realized that actually a cloud strategy that uses best-of-breed services from multiple clouds might be a better fit. Well, great. Then you go through this process again to reevaluate and incorporate that evolution. But in order to do that, you have to have a feedback loop to be able to reevaluate. And finally, last but certainly not least, empower. Just as with anything else and any other strategy, you have to empower the people that use and operate the solution, in this case, multi-cloud, to be able to use it effectively and wield it well. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with some puns, because again, I think I'm funny. Use place to determine your place on multi-cloud strategy. And then, oh, by the way, if you do end up saying yes to multi-cloud and you figure out what kind of multi-cloud that actually looks like for your organization, you then got to figure out your application placement. See that placement? To choose among your multi-cloud destination. That is actually a whole story unto itself. I do apologize for the puns. My children tell me that I'm not actually that funny. And if you want to talk more about application placement or multi-cloud, please find me at office hours.